What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today I wanted to talk about crossplay in Call of Duty and whether or not I feel it's been good or bad for the franchise overall since it was introduced. And with this, I am going to be splitting this up into two different sections because there is a very important distinction to be made between cross-input play and cross-platform play. And also, I just want to clarify here, this is from the perspective of a multiplayer player. I'm just talking about the multiplayer aspect of the game. Warzone is a totally different thing that may have different arguments surrounding it, especially since each game requires so many more players in a single match. Now with this, lately I've been seeing this topic pop up more and more, and that's why I wanted to cover it. And we're going to start this off focusing just on cross-platform play. So we're not talking about inputs like controller versus mouse and keyboard for this section. This is just the platform that you play on, whether that's Xbox, PlayStation, or PC, which comprises of Battle.net and Steam. And let's first talk about the pros of this. The first pro is obviously there's a larger player pool to draw from for everybody that's playing the game. And in theory at least, this should lead to faster matchmaking times, as well as a better connection, although in practice that doesn't seem to hold true due to the matchmaking system they use, and the fact that ping isn't necessarily king anymore. But I think more importantly, with this larger player pool to draw from, there's a lower chance of mode death for the lesser played platforms, which in the case of Call of Duty is PC. And this is a big issue that Call of Duty did have on PC for many years before crossplay was introduced, especially once you started getting later in a game's life cycle, or you want to try to go back to like last year's game, for instance, on PC, you were pretty limited in the modes that you were able to play and still be able to find a match with a reasonable connection, or even at all in some cases. You basically had to stick to the really popular modes like Team Deathmatch, Domination, and Search and Destroy. So obviously this is the first big pro to cross-platform play. This was a huge benefit to the PC players out there because they can go back to even Modern Warfare 2019 right now and find a game in just about any game mode, no problem. Whereas without crossplay, I don't think that would be possible at all. But on top of that, there is another fairly big pro here, and this is with cross-platform play, you can play with anybody that you want that has the game, regardless of what platform they're on. So if you have a friend that's on Xbox but you're on PlayStation, that's okay. You can play with that friend now. You don't have to try to convince them to get the console that you're playing on so that you guys can play together. And honestly, that's pretty much it when it comes to the pros of cross-input play, although those are some pretty big pros for a lot of people. Now let's get into the cons, the issue with cross-platform play. And the first big one here is things like aimbots and wall hacks have now spread and affect all platforms instead of just one platform, with that problem platform also having the smallest player base overall. So basically the majority are no longer shielded from the smaller platform where all of these issues come from. Now, to be clear, other forms of cheating are still possible on console. I'm not saying cheating doesn't exist in any form on console. You can cheat via input manipulation devices like Chronuses or strike packs. And while I am firmly against cheating in all its forms, at the end of the day, a Chronus or a strike pack is going to be far less impactful than actual aimbots and wall hacks in the game. And I do feel like this has really eroded a lot of the confidence in the game for console players. With the last generation of consoles, PS4 and Xbox One, before crossplay was introduced in Call of Duty, I never had to question whether an enemy was using an aimbot or a wall hack. That just never even popped into my mind. Now, unless you're on PlayStation with crossplay disabled, there's always that little thought in the back of your mind that maybe that guy is using walls, maybe that guy is using aimbots. And like I said, I feel like this has really eroded a lot of the confidence in the game for the vast majority of the Call of Duty player base, which is on console. And that's the biggest con and the biggest point against cross-platform play in Call of Duty. I do feel like this has introduced a lot of issues for a lot of players that simply didn't exist before crossplay was introduced, at least on the PS4 generation and up. I do realize the older consoles like PS3 and Xbox 360, those consoles were compromised and you could run into actual aimbots and wall hacks in those. But we never really had to worry about that stuff since those days. Now, in saying that, that's not the only downside with cross-platform play. Another downside is the potential for massive discrepancy in the actual game performance, as well as the settings that you're able to alter. With this, high-end PCs are capable of achieving much higher frame rates than especially the older generations of consoles, so PS4 or Xbox One, which are capped at 60 FPS. A good PC can get a significantly higher frame rate than that, and they can also have higher resolutions. They're able to tweak a lot of their graphics settings as well, which can give them small gameplay advantages at least. And with this, I will say that discrepancy is primarily just with the previous generation consoles versus PC, because with the newer gen consoles with 120 FPS potential, as well as the ability to play on higher resolutions than the old consoles, this is less of an issue and less of a discrepancy, even though there is still some of a discrepancy there. So I will put this on this cons list as well, although this is nowhere nearly as important as the previous con that I shared. After that, we have another big con with how crossplay is currently implemented in Call of Duty at least, and that is only one platform has the ability to opt out of crossplay in the game, and this is PlayStation. So that is another disparity as well between these platforms. And then the final con that I wanted to mention here, which we're going to get into this topic in a little bit, this is, with cross-platform play, you're much more likely to run into mixed inputs in lobbies. And that comes with its own set of issues that I'm going to be outlining soon. But before we get into that, I did want to talk about some of the potential solutions to these issues with cross-platform play. And the first solution just seems obvious to me. All platforms should be given the option to opt out of crossplay, at least for regular like 6v6 or 10v10 multiplayer. Obviously, with Ground War, with a higher player count in the match, crossplay would likely have to be enabled for everybody, just so everybody can actually find full lobbies all the time. But when it comes to 6v6, I feel like the player base can easily support every platform being able to opt out of crossplay if they choose to. Especially when you consider the fact that most players wouldn't even touch that setting, they probably wouldn't even know that setting existed, and therefore there would always be those players that would be able to play with any platform in the matchmaking system. Additionally, in an ideal world, I would love to see console players have an additional option with their crossplay filters that allows them to opt out of PC crossplay while still maintaining crossplay with the other console platform. So people with this setting on can have PlayStation and Xbox players in the same game, but they will never run into a PC player, and therefore they won't have to worry about people having aimbots or wall hacks in their lobbies, at least with the current security system that's in place with these consoles. So there we go. I think the solutions there are pretty obvious, and I think this would be an excellent solution to implement into the game by just allowing everybody to opt out if they choose, but you have crossplay on by default, which means PC players are still going to have a significantly larger pool of players to connect to at any given time than they would if there was literally no crossplay at all for them. Now, let's move on to the second part of this video, which is going to be talking about cross-input play, so mouse and keyboard versus controller. And with this, I want to focus on the system itself more than comparing mouse and keyboard to controller a whole lot. Obviously, there's going to be a little bit of comparison here, but this isn't a topic of which one is better or which one is stronger. This is just a topic looking at the pros and cons of cross-input play, as well as some potential solutions to this. And with this, the pros are pretty much the same as the cross-platform pros. With cross-input play, it allows for a larger player pool to draw from, especially for the mouse and keyboard players out there, which are a significantly smaller portion of the player base compared to controller players. And same thing, in theory, this should lead to faster matchmaking and a better connection, although the evidence isn't there that this leads to a better connection. And also, there's a smaller chance of modes dying off on the lesser played inputs, which in this case is mouse and keyboard. Additionally, for the second pro, you can play with anyone regardless of their preferred input. So if you have a friend that really likes mouse and keyboard, but you like controller, you have the ability to play with that friend, whereas previously, one of you had to make the switch if you wanted to play together. So really, it's the same pros there. Now let's move on to the cons. And the first big con here, and the main topic, is these inputs are inherently different. And in my opinion, at least, they will never be 100% perfectly balanced against each other, no matter which direction you go. You're always going to lean in one direction or the other. Either aim assist is too strong and therefore controller has the advantage, or you make aim assist too weak and now mouse and keyboard has the advantage. Or even just on a situation-to-situation basis, one input might have an advantage, whereas the other one might have an advantage in a different situation. And while developers can really try their best to find a balance there, they're never going to find perfect balance between these inputs. And in addition to this, when you have mixed inputs in a lobby, this just creates inconsistency on a gunfight-to-gunfight basis. Because people with different inputs will tend to have certain behaviors that are going to be different, as well as certain strengths and weaknesses attached to their input. So with controller players, for instance, in Call of Duty at least, we have that fairly strong rotational aim assist, which means in close quarter situations with a lot of movement, controller players tend to have an advantage over mouse and keyboard players. On the other side of the equation though, a good mouse and keyboard player versus a good controller player is typically going to be more accurate at longer ranges and therefore have the advantage in long range fights. And another thing that I notice quite a bit when I'm in mixed input lobbies is, especially when you're in the higher skilled lobbies, mouse and keyboard players are typically able to have a really fast, snappy turn potential that an equally skilled controller player wouldn't be able to have. So being able to perform a really quick, perfect 180 right on target, while I definitely acknowledge the skill that's attached to doing that consistently, a mouse and keyboard player is able to do that, whereas an equally skilled controller player playing on a competitive sensitivity is simply unable to do that same move in the same speed because they're limited by that sensitivity value and the input that they're using. And the thing with this inconsistency is you don't really know what that player is capable of and how they're going to react based on their input until you're actually in that fight. And this just creates general engagement inconsistency. And I like knowing what everybody is capable of. I like it when everybody's on an equal playing field. I've got a controller in my hands. I know you've got a controller in your hands. Or if I am playing mouse and keyboard, I've got a mouse and keyboard in my hands. You've got a mouse and keyboard in your hands. And nobody has aim assist in that situation. With cross-input play and mixed lobbies, this consistency is gone. And this is why, despite the general sentiment that I see online that aim assist is way too strong and controller is way better than mouse and keyboard, as a controller player, I don't like playing against mouse and keyboard players. I would still much rather play against other controller players, which might seem odd because you would think I'd want to play against the weaker input with my stronger input, but at the end of the day, it's more so about consistency and having a level playing field across the board. A large portion of mouse and keyboard players seem to hate playing against controller players in Call of Duty, and as a controller player, I dislike playing against mouse and keyboard players, and I would much rather we have the inputs completely separated. So when it comes to this, I think the solution's a little bit less obvious, and it comes with a few more problems than the cross-platform play solutions that I had. But ideally for me, for regular 6v6 or 10v10 multiplayer, there should be a strict restriction on cross-input play unless you're playing in a mixed input party. And then if you are in a mixed input party, then you should be placed in mouse and keyboard lobbies. And I'll just walk you through the logic on this. This is actually how XDefiant is going to be handling cross-input play, or at least that's what they're going to be trying at launch, as far as Mark Rubin has said. But with this system, a solo controller player or a controller player that's playing with other controller players in their party will literally never see a mouse and keyboard player in their lobby. So therefore, they get that consistency all the time. But then with this system, if they want to play with a mouse and keyboard friend, they have the ability to do so. However, now they're going to be playing against mouse and keyboard players. So this still allows for cross-input play, and it still makes for a somewhat larger player pool for mouse and keyboard players than if we had no cross-input play at all. And while they would still have to deal with some inconsistency where they would run into the odd controller player, it would be much more rare than it currently is, and it would allow them to at least have a somewhat larger player pool to draw from, and to also fill up lobbies a little bit faster. So again, it's not a perfect solution. Perhaps mouse and keyboard players would then suffer a little bit more than they currently are because the player pool would be restricted a lot more, although less than if there were zero cross-input play at all. But this is at least a potential solution that could have some positive impact overall on this debate with cross-input play. At the end of the day, I still think if they just sorted out cross-platform play the way I laid it out, where everybody is able to opt out of cross-platform play, I think that would largely take care of the cross-input play issue as well, especially for console players out there. If you opt out of cross-platform play, it would be extremely rare that you run into a mouse and keyboard player because there are so few of them playing mouse and keyboard on console. And so perhaps that would already just take care of that cross-input play issue. But with that, that is going to wrap it up for all of my thoughts on the pros and cons of crossplay as it currently exists in the Call of Duty franchise, as well as some potential solutions to improve this system. And this is where I want to hear from you guys in those comments down below. Overall, do you think the introduction of crossplay in Call of Duty was a net positive or negative to the franchise? Again, focusing primarily on multiplayer, I think Warzone is a completely different story, and crossplay is a good idea there. In fact, it's probably necessary there to some degree. But for regular multiplayer, do you think this is a good thing, and do you like how it's currently implemented, or would you like to see some change here? If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.